Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World, the extraordinary true story of Shackleton and the Endurance. Chapter 10, Patience, Patience, Patience. On January 1st, Ord-Lees was skiing near the edge of a floe when a 12-foot-long fanged leopard seal lunged out of the water and began humping toward him at astonishing speed. With a terrified yell, Ord-Lees stumbled across the ice toward camp. Suddenly, the animal lunged back into the water. As Ord-Lees had reached the opposite side of the floe, the leopard seal burst out of the water in front of him, jaws agape. Screaming, Ord-Lees turned his skis and headed back. His frantic cries brought Wild out of the tent with his rifle, and Wild immediately dropped to one knee, raised the weapon, and began firing and cursing furiously at Ord-Lees. The leopard seal now rushed toward Wild, who shot again and again. The animal was only 30 feet away from Wild when it fell at last. The entire crew was breathless. An attack by a leopard seal was not a great way to begin life in a new camp. Everyone knew they were in the worst circumstances they had been in, even at ocean camp. They had fewer provisions and less equipment with them. The ice was growing so soft they often had to crawl on their hands and knees through saltwater slush, while hungry beasts that looked upon men as a new variety of food cruised through the dark waters just below them. And although there were seals around them to hunt, the men grew alarmed when the animals became harder and harder to find. Their food stores were running out. On January 13th, Shackleton announced that most of the dogs would have to be killed. A dog required a seal a day, while the whole crew could survive on one seal for several days. For the time being, the boss would spare Hurley's, Macklin's, and Greenstreet's teams in order to return to Ocean Camp for supplies when conditions permitted. The other dogs were taken one by one behind a large block of ice and shot. A gale set in on the 15th, and the winds of more than 70 miles per hour drove them north for 6 days. On the 21st, Worsley's astronomical observations indicated that they had crossed the Antarctic Circle. Shackleton celebrated the occasion by issuing an extra round of hot viral, a powdered drink mix, to all hands. Progress to the north was what they had all hoped for, and yet some of the men, especially Worsley and Macklin, remained uneasy about the boats. Worsley had little confidence that they would take to the open ocean in only 2 boats, and he pestered Shackleton every day about returning to Ocean Camp for the Stancomb Wills. On January 22nd, Worsley climbed a hillock of ice and saw that the gale that had blown them north had also compacted the ice and blown Ocean Camp closer to their position. Shackleton debated for days. The condition of the pack was miserable for travel and not likely to get any better. If they were to ever retrieve the 3rd boat, they must do so sooner rather than later. Finally, at the end of the month, he decided to risk a salvage mission. Wild left Patience Camp with 18 men at 1 o'clock in the morning on February 1st. The rest of the crew waited, some of them crying from restlessness, depression, or anxiety. According to Hurley, Ocean Camp presented a forlorn appearance, resembling a deserted Alaskan mining village that had been ransacked by bandits. The men scavenged what they could, loaded the boat, and headed back. At Patience Camp, Shackleton stood watch. In a new galley made by wrapping canvas around 4 oars stuck upright in the snow. Green kept the hot potato can stoked. At 11 a.m., Shackleton saw the salvage party returning, and he went out to meet them with a kettle of hot tea. Shortly after noon, the Stancomb Wills and some of the remaining stores were safely back in camp. With the exception of Macklin's team, the remaining dogs were shot. Hurley was heartbroken, and I said goodbye to my faithful old leader, Shakespeare, with an aching heart. It seemed like murdering in cold blood a trusty pal, but alas, there was no alternative. Food was running short, and the end was inevitable, for the dogs could not be taken in the boats. And now there was really nothing left to do but wait. The men suffered from a diet that consisted almost entirely of meat. Constipation and flatulence, or squeaky gut as the men called it, made them even more uncomfortable than they already were. With no yeast, the flour that they had could not be made into bread, but instead was baked into heavy unleavened scones. The top On top of their intestinal problems, the wind made the men's eyes water constantly, and their tears would drip down their noses and form small icicles, which would break off, tearing a bit of skin at the same time. Dog bites and knife nicks on the men's hands were frequently infected with seal blood, but there was no antibiotics to treat the inflammation. When the surface of the floe was firm enough, the men would exercise by marching back and forth, always on the lookout for predatory leopard seals. Some of the men were morbidly convinced that a killer whale would crash upward through the dwindling floe, tossing them into the water and picking them off one by one. They became obsessed with the wind, its direction, its speed, its temperature. They were all miserable, cold, and completely filthy, since the last of their soap had been saved for Green, who stood all day in the greasy smoke of the blubbering stoves. They began calling their forced imprisonment the Ice Age. The games and amusements that had passed the time with them on board the Endurance were forgotten. No one had the heart for charades or poetry recitals or comic songs. The monotony was punctuated by meals. Between meals, they waited for the next. They read and reread their small stock of books. Watches were kept for seals, and if the ice was favorable, a hunting party would go out to kill them. Very often there were no seals. They ate penguins when they could get them. 20 penguins, cooked by the fuel of their own skins, was a fair daily average. Hurley said later, young penguins were tasty enough, much like chicken, but the older penguins were difficult to cut with the knife and almost impossible to choose. The worst thing is having to kill time, James wrote in his diary. It seems such a waste. Yet there's nothing else to do. McNeish wrote, there is nothing for it but to get into our sleeping bags and smoke away the hunger. The water is dripping from the tent roof, Macklin wrote in his diary. I pray God to give us dry weather soon, for this is misery. I have never seen such depression of spirits and as there is in this tent. The boss knew how dire their plight was. Almost every night he shouted himself awake from nightmares in which he pictured one disaster or emergency after another. Would the boats be separated when they took to the ocean? Would he himself be incapacitated? Would Worsley's navigational books? The picture and caption on page 68. In the frigid air, moisture from the men's breath froze on their whiskers, forming icicles. Lionel Greenstreet, the first officer, posed for this picture, illustrating the effect. Would Worsley's navigational books be lost? Would they run out of food? One after another, disasters visited his sleep and shook him awake. Then, in the remaining hours of the night, he would form plans for meeting the crisis he had dreamed of. In spite of his anxiety, he tried to keep up the appearance of calm in order to maintain morale. Although tortured by worry, he remained outwardly unperturbed. He was always cheerful and gave everyone confidence that we would get out, said Bakewell, oblivious to the boss's unease. Shackleton believed that keeping to some pretense of normal routine would calm the men's nerves and settle their fears. Meals were served strictly according to schedule. Watches were rotated regularly. He woke the men by whistle every morning and gave the order to lash up and stow for his own sanity. Shackleton played bridge and taught others how to play. He also played exactly 4 hands of poker with Hurley every afternoon. By the end of the 10 weeks, he had won imaginary tickets to all of the London theaters, boxes of linen handkerchiefs, silk umbrellas, a mirror, and a coveted collector's copy of Paradise Regained from Hurley, while Hurley had won from Shackleton a shaving mirror, several top hats, enough walking sticks to equip a regiment, several sets of cuffed links, and a library of books, as well as a dinner at Claridge's Hotel in London and a box at the opera. Remain calm. Keep to the normal routines. Patience, 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 the boss wrote in his diary. On February 8th, one of the men found a twig tangled in some seaweed, and the crew gathered around as the twig was fed to the fire. The scent of burning wood reminded everyone of a land so far away and sunk many of the men into nostalgia and fresh pangs of homesickness. On February 20th, a crew awoke to find that their floe had been invaded by an enormous flock of Adelie penguins migrating north. Each man fell to a taste of killing as many as they could. With no natural enemies out in the water, the penguins were easy to catch. Although the birds did not provide much meat, their skins, lined with a thick layer of fat, made a good fuel for the blubber stove. Over the next 2 days, the crew had brought in more than 600 Adelies. Then the flock moved on, and the ice around Patience Camp was streaked with blood and red penguin guano. The crew continued to wait. The days dragged slowly on, growing shorter as autumn set in. The weather was gray, rainy, cold, and damp. The ice pack continued its slow, enormous revolution north through the Weddell Sea. When the blubber supply ran alarmingly low, Shackleton reduced the ration of warm drinks to one a day. All their hopes were now pinned on getting safely to the open ocean before the ice floe they camped on broke into pieces. If the pack disintegrated too soon, they would be unable to launch the boats and maneuver in the jumble of broken and grinding ice, and unable to find a large floe enough to camp on. Day passes day with very little or nothing to relieve the monotony. Greenstreet wrote in his diary on March 5th. We take constitutional rounds and round the floe, but no one can go further, as we are all intent on purposes of the island. There is practically nothing fresh to read and nothing to talk about, all topics being absolutely exhausted. The pack around looks very much as it did 4 or 5 months ago, and with the low temperature we have been getting at night, example 0 or below, the open patches of water getting covered with young ice, which is neither fit to go over nor would allow the passage of the boats. It was more than a year since Endurance had first become stuck in the ice. Some of the men were dangerously close to believing they would never get out of the ice at all. On March 9th, for the first time since entering the pack, the men felt the swell of the ocean slowly lift the ice under their feet. Around them, the pack was creaking and groaning rhythmically, like the breathing of an immense animal. The open ocean was 30 miles away.